Good morning, everybody. I hope everyone had a good dinner, a good sleep, and you're all ready to go. Before we get started with this morning's speakers, I wanted to make a few announcements about what's going to happen today. As you know, in the materials we sent you, we said the breakouts this morning are going to be, people are going to be self-selected instead of assigned. We've created two whiteboards over to my left where I'm pointing. One of them is labeled breakout groups, and a few people have proposed topics and volunteered to lead those topics. I invite you to think about whether there's a cluster group you would like to gather to lead a breakout, and to prepare a post-it with the topic and your name as the volunteer leader. We're going to sign up for these breakouts during the break. By having topics, we're going to accomplish a number of things. We're trying to make sure that everything gets on the table. And in particular, as I said to you yesterday, we took an application pull focus in the way we organized the discussions yesterday. When you look at the topics, you'll see some of them are technology push. In other words, there are groups who work on certain technologies, who propose to get together in a breakout group and lay out the research agenda, much as we did with the various breakout topics yesterday, but starting from a perspective of here's an area of technology such as assistive technologies, which is one of the ones that's already on the board. Let's try and flesh out a research vision around that topic. So I invite you to think about, as we're talking this morning, whether there's a topic you feel really needs to be in the mix, whether you're willing to help form a breakout group. I would say critical mass is probably 5 people. If there aren't 5 people who sign on, then you might want to move to another breakout group. This is a very creative group of people, and we could easily end up with 100 breakouts with one person in each of them. And I don't think that's what we want. So I'm going to ask you to think a little bit about how you decide how you're going to spend your breakout time. Someone also observed to me that some of you have been excessively modest in talking about your own research passions. And this is an opportunity for you to talk a little bit more about your research passions in the space of healthcare and information technology. So that's one announcement. And topics can go up there that are prompted by this morning's discussion. This doesn't all have to be an outgrowth of yesterday. There's also space on the board which is labeled Other Topics, where you can just take a post-it, put up an idea that you think it's important to be represented. It might have been mentioned in a breakout yesterday, but didn't make it to the topic that was discussed. It might be something you thought about in the middle of the night. It might be something that's prompted by this morning's discussion. But there's place to take post-its and just put up your really good ideas. And finally, we've added another speaker. Eric Horowitz is going to give a brief talk during lunch. We have a working lunch today. There'll be box lunches outside when it gets to be lunchtime. We're going to have the reporting out from the breakouts during lunch. Then we're going to have a presentation from Eric, and then we're going to move into what have we learned, where do we go. Here's what the synthesis of the research agenda in health and information technology is that we want to present to the community. So that's the plan for today. I'll now turn the podium over to Deborah Estrin, who will chair the first session. Oh, I'm sorry, Deborah. One more thing. I've posted on that other topics board 2 email addresses. I'd really like people who have electronic summaries of your breakouts or even notes from sessions that you took personally that you feel it would be helpful to share. Mail them either to Erwin, whose email is up there, or to me, and you've by now all got an email from me. Thank you.
So inspired by Eric yesterday, I really wanted to introduce this morning's speakers and start a new tradition by bringing up information I could find on their SNPs by doing some Google and Bing searches, but I had other things to do last night, so I didn't stay up doing that. And for those of you who weren't here yesterday, that will make no sense. And somebody asked me, was I kidding when I asked Eric that question, and I wasn't kidding at all. I was quite serious. So it's my pleasure to introduce this morning's session speakers. Yesterday, I think all but one of our speakers were actually, their native tongues. They received their degrees on the IT or engineering side of the in this room, not so great divide. And in this morning, it's not that case. In this case, the native tongues and formal degrees are actually in medicine for both of our speakers, and yet both of them are clearly characterized as being as much techies as any of us in the room. And in speaking about our first speaker, Rich Buchholz, some of his colleagues and people have known him for a while this morning, they said he's the guy who always is sitting there at a meeting with lots and lots of gadgets around him and on him. And so it was not hard for me to find him in the room quite quickly. He didn't bring them up to the podium other than his Bluetooth and his iPhone. But back at his place, surrounded by him, are packets of little devices. He has been an innovator, particularly in navigation assistance for surgery. And let's hear from him.
Thank you very much. I'll be walking around, as is my habit. How do we get the... They reverse this? Okay. Okay. As is wont with medical presentations, I will start off with... it needs time to find the drive. I'll first start on my disclosures. I'm definitely honored to be with you here today. Obviously, I do feel somewhat out of my ilk in that I am a physician and a neurosurgeon, so I am cowed by the engineering prowess that was on display yesterday. In terms of disclosures, I do have royalty on the intellectual property that's been licensed to Medtronic, and I do have a financial interest in an entity called Medical Operating Room Networks. The organizers of this conference impressed upon the speakers that we wanted to have a specific format to the way we presented our particular talk. And in this, I will talk about a clear problem that I see within the medical delivery, a promising line of attack, and suggest a test bed, which I think really demonstrates the complexity of medical care in this current age, and how we might be able to address that with the appropriate use of technology. Obviously, in this group, we have talked a lot about the medical problems that we face. And to me, one of the key issues, particularly within neurosurgery, is that medical care has become technologically and experientially quite intense. If you want examples of that, think about the endovascular management of stroke, which takes a tremendous amount of technical expertise in terms of coiling and getting catheters into the brain. Image-guided resection of tumors, which is based upon intraoperative MRI imaging, and functional restoration using deep brain stimulation, in which electrodes are inserted into the brain in real time with the patient awake in order to achieve a functional result. Furthermore, optimal medical delivery oftentimes is time-dependent. These are things, many times, which cannot be done in a leisurely fashion. Intervention for stroke is a prime example. It's calculated the first 4 hours are the golden window for stroke intervention. For trauma, it may be down to a magic hour to resuscitate an individual. And interventions for cardiac conditions also suffer from specific temporal limitations. The problem is that all of these technological interventions are marked by usually isolated technologies which come rolling into a therapeutic suite and which we in the medical profession called LCDs on a stick. Everybody's got their own little box that comes in, goes out, and does something and goes away when their time is done. Furthermore, the expertise to deliver these technologically intensive interventions is not uniformly distributed. A recent survey has indicated that for many Americans, the neurosurgeon is at least 60 miles away, and the implication is that that neurosurgeon in many instances may not even be doing the type of surgery that that particular individual needs on an urgent basis. Furthermore, this holds true for multiple specialties as well. And finally, the demand for these most advanced medical treatments are increasing with the aging of our population, the increased world prosperity and the demand for advanced medical care, and obviously the increase in world population as well. So how can we really expedite the delivery of technologically and experientially intense medical therapy on an expedited basis? To me, there's an analogous situation with what happened with imaging technology. Many, in the past, scanners had file formats, which were not shareable, and that really prevented the review of imaging from different scanners in a real-time fashion. This, after a great deal of pressure from the user population, that caused the DICOM standard to be established, and is really the foundation of all PACS devices, which are really at the core of any radiology department in any hospital in the United States currently. To me, an optimal solution in the therapeutic realm would be the seamless sharing of clinically relevant information such that information generated by a device and control of that device would be shared instantaneously, and this would require the implementation of a standard for those particular devices. Now, oftentimes when you're dealing with medical information, the generation of that information itself requires medical expertise. For example, in imaging, particularly with magnetic resonance imaging and ultrasound, you have to actually fine-tune the device in order to obtain the optimal images. An ultrasound image obtained under adverse conditions is essentially useless. And this is particularly true of information in the intraoperative or in the emergency room situation, where positioning of an ultrasound probe, making certain that you see the structure that you're worried about, is really quite key, and adjusting illumination to make certain that what you are doing, the intervention, is proceeding in an appropriate way. To me, an optimal solution then would allow bidirectional control and monitoring of an information source in real time in the operating room. Now, this is the, many of you may have seen hospital advertisements, and this is the sort of advertisement you see, the kind of ideal situation. Here we have image-guided intervention on the brain, microscope to provide illumination and magnification, the navigational system to provide positional information, an intraoperative MRI. That is the pretty side of technology. The ugly side of technology is this. This is the storeroom that these devices come from. Each of these devices has its own little cable. Every cable is coiled. Every cable has a connector that doesn't plug into anything else. And trying to get that to all come together into the operating room takes a lot of dedicated effort, and in many instances, 1 to 2 hours worth of effort to get everything all tied together. So how then best to implement a standard in this field of medical therapeutics? And I would suggest that this field is particularly balkanized when compared to the imaging sector. Rather than 4 or 5 major imaging companies, we literally have hundreds of devices made by lots of different companies. And it's really difficult to envision the situation in which there'd be a standard that would be acceptable to all these little groups. So I would suggest that we need to employ an existing standard that's already out there, that's already deployed on a frequent basis, and is used to share and generate information. And to me, the most promising candidate would be the web markup language that each one of us uses on a daily basis to control our lives. Now, how do you make the web a communication standard for medical devices? I would suggest that each device be equipped with its own small server applet. Web pages would be stored in the non-volatile memory of the device, which would serve as the control pages for that particular device. Therefore, the manufacturer of the device would be completely free to design whatever web pages they want to control the particularities of that device. At the same time, each device would have a network port consisting of either a wired port or a Wi-Fi access point. And the information then obtained by the device, if it was a generation device, generating device, would be streamed by a standard protocol through that Ethernet portal, be it a wired or wireless connection. Therefore, when the device would be brought into a therapy suite, and by a therapy suite I mean anything like an operating room, a trauma bay, an emergency room, or even the back of an ambulance for that matter, that device would be automatically attached to the local area network within that particular therapy suite. So this is the general schematic of what such a device would look like. Here you have the particular control device. The local control of the device would be executed by the same web pages that are transmitted over the network, placed on a display device on that local device. The network would then attach it to the local area network within the therapy suite. The implementation of this type of server application is really quite inexpensive now. It's about $150, and we can oftentimes put these small servers on the chip that can be embedded in the device. And the interesting thing is that by having web pages in the device, you can actually support multiple language for use of the device overseas with non-English speaking areas. Now, there are all sorts of control devices that one could think of that could become under this type of paradigm. There would be simple devices that simply would be controlled and not generate information. These could be as diverse as an operating room bed, a coagulator for bleeding, or even a light source for endoscopic manipulation. A compound device that not only needs to be controlled, but generates an information stream, such as an ultrasound probe, patient monitoring equipment like the anesthetic monitor, or an operating room microscope generating video. And then complex devices that need to have, in many instances, autonomous control information, say between an operating room microscope aimed by a navigational system or even a robot being controlled by a system in the operating room. Each of these devices then would have the ability to produce information on a real-time basis. And for example, these are 3 examples of like an operating microscope that would be streaming video, a life support equipment that would be showing specific characteristics of the patient's physiology during the operation. And then finally, in their physiology, recording things from the brain, et cetera, those specific waves could be transmitted in real time over MPEG streams. What would happen then is each one of these devices, upon coming into the operating room, would be recognized by the local area network within that therapy suite and be recognized and placed up upon the therapist's console. Now, this is a device in the broadest sense of the word, which is able to display the devices in the room as a list. And by clicking on the device, the controls for that particular device would be available to the operating surgeon. The information would also be streamed in real time. And this console, importantly, would be equipped actually with 2 ports, one for the local area network within the therapy suite, and another one to the wider area network of the hospital, which would then connect to the internet. By having this type of connection, the surgeon at her or his sole discretion would have the ability to share either the control applet or the streaming applet with any outside remote consultant. So what would this look like? Here you have the surgeon's console, which consists of a router firewall that would be programmed to have specific port opening using a graphic user interface. You'd have switches so that each device would be attached into the suite's local area network. And the only time information would leave the network or leave the therapy suite would be at the behest of the therapist with their specific direction. The display device could be anything in terms of what one could conceive of as some sort of thing to interact with the therapist. And this, again, could represent an LCD on the stick. It could represent multiple display monitors. And we've even been able to combine multiple display monitors into a unified screen so that literally multiple devices controlled by a keyboard and mouse could be done through a specific screen. Finally, we've also gone to the point now where we actually have stereoscopic displays in the operating room. This is an example of a stereoscopic pair generated by 2 DVI projectors viewed by polarized glasses so that the surgeon can actually see a stereoscopic 3-dimensional image and then manipulate that image using gestures in on the operating room so as to maintain sterility as the surgeon interacts with the information streaming from the appliances in the operating room. Now, what would the screen look like? If you have a simple device, in this say like a bipolar coagulator, you would simply have a small screen to come up, increasing, decreasing the power of coagulation and to affect the coagulator. And the interesting thing then is that sharing of the device in terms of informational stream could also be achieved through a graphical user interface. What would happen is that remote consultants would come up on a list in the therapist suite, and by simply dragging and dropping a specific device onto an icon of that remote consultant, a connection would be made and the port opened in the firewall to allow streaming of data. The important thing is that the data could be streamed and at the surgeon's request, control of the device could also be streamed so that the outside consultant could optimize the information stream, the quality of the stream being sent to that person. The important thing then is privacy and the sterility of the operating room in terms of maintaining confidentiality within that therapy suite is completely under control of the local surgeon and the local surgeon only. The remote workstation used by the outside consultant could just be a standard PC. The connectivity speed of that PC obviously would have impact upon the quality of the images being transmitted. But basically all you need is the appropriate browser, a webcam for communication, and the remote consultant, as pictured on this screen, would see the exact same control mechanisms that the surgeon uses if the surgeon has indeed implemented a sharing of that device. Now, we have asked to suggest a specific test bed where this may be appropriate for use. And one I would suggest is one of the more complicated procedures that we do within neurosurgery, placement of a brain electrode. This is a technique where we actually insert an electrode deep into a specific structure of the brain called the subthalamic nucleus. We have to track position in real time. We have to choose our target based upon anatomical location, and then fine-tune the location of the electrode using intraoperative neurophysiology with the patient awake. So what are the steps? First of all is interpreting the images to know where the subthalamic nucleus is. Then generating a plan so that you avoid major structures such as vessels and ventricles to get to that target in real time. You have to co-register the patient to the images, in this case performed by a miniaturized CT scanner in the operating room. You then have to drive the electrode using either robotic technology or some sort of a frame so that the electrode goes exactly to where you want to, tracking in real time with a navigational system. And then you have to have intraoperative neurophysiology. And here's a classic example of a cost saving that could be affected by this device. This individual, our neurophysiologist, actually has an expertise that is highly sought after in the medical field. And this individual is actually, we spend $4,000 per case bringing this person up from Nashville simply to do the neurophysiology for each case. I would suggest that we were able to network that person very effectively with this procedure. Finally, we have to confirm position intraoperatively with another CT scanner. Each individual steps requires the use of a technical device. Each requires the use of a computer, and each requires use of information streams that could be covered by such a device. And this particular standard would address each requirement in real time by allowing each device to be used and shared as it is wheeled into the operating room and then wheeled out. All information streams would be shared, including video, audio, as well as static imaging. One of the important things that I think needs to be stressed is that each therapy suite has to have at its root plasticity. Very few operating rooms and very few hospitals can dedicate a specific operating room to a specific function. And so each operating room must be able to do, say, a craniotomy at one moment and then a cardiothoracic surgery in the next moment. And of course, the instrumentation necessary for each of those procedures is entirely different. And one of the ways that Sandra could help is by literally recognizing the devices as they come into the operating room and then set up the device per the surgeon's preference. The design objectives are then achieved in that each device is assured of a specific bandwidth. Each device is controllable by a central location. The surgeon's preferences can be set up basically using a USB memory stick into the surgeon's suite, surgeon's console. And these devices, most importantly, can be removed from the system as well, because in many instances, these very important and expensive devices have to be shared in real time. Furthermore, when not in an operating room suite, these devices can be hooked up to the network and report back to the mothership and indicate their status, whether something's broken, how they were utilized, etc. The benefits then is that one cable or one Wi-Fi connection establishes the entire standard. The device can be brought in, connected with one cable alone, and then utilized in a real-time fashion in order to have the device used locally, as well as to be able to use the resources of an expert, at some distance away from the operating suite. To me, this type of proposal really addresses the needs of a medical delivery in the future. It assures a shielded space, which is controllable by the local surgeon. It allows life support issues to be displayed and shared with clinicians as they need to do. And it allows the use of multiple display devices optimized to the surgeon's preferences for a particular surgical intervention. Furthermore, the instant recognition, I think, is really a key aspect of what is needed in our operating rooms, particularly in community hospitals which cannot have dedicated operating rooms. So finally, this is kind of the way it is now, with each device having to interact with each other and not having any type of standard interface. What we're proposing with this standard is a unified web-based markup language type solution with an optional connection to the internet under the control of the surgeon in real time. I would suggest that here in the medical parlance, it is high time that we address the Tower of Babel that has been created in our operating rooms and finalize on a standard protocol which connects all of our therapeutic devices. Thank you for your attention. Yep. Questions? Yes?
From UC Berkeley. Your vision is fantastic. However, in this room, I assure you, we are all collectively have capabilities to deliver this vision. Of course, there are how to connect pieces is really a big research unsolved problem. My question is not for your vision, but it is for our colleagues from Washington, D.C. Here is the problem. If you go to the National Science Foundation, they will say, where is the basic fundamental research, either in technology or in the biological sciences? When you go to NIH, NIH will say, oh, this is too techy. Okay? If you go to NIST, they will say, well, where are the standards? So I think this kind of vision is really calling for the Washington agencies to get together and sort this out and have a very different approach how this kind of research, where absolutely is needed, will be supported. Thank you.
I fully agree. The research field shares some of the balkanization of the medical device field. And having earlier in my life developed a navigational system, that fully fell between the NSF and the NIH. The interesting thing is that the market actually, in many instances, may drive this because hospitals are under absolute pressure to try to cost control. And right now, these devices are not being used appropriately. And the hospitals, the users, are actually demanding some technique to be able to optimize the use of these very expensive technologies. An intraoperative MRI costs $1.5 to $2 million. That needs to be networked. Yep.
Excuse me, one more thing. There is a danger if we leave this to the companies, because each company will be pushing their own standards, their own devices, their own. This vision requires a much more multi-device, multi-component approach. And therefore, I don't believe that the companies will do the justice to what your vision is about.
That's an interesting segment.
Right. Right, and that's the open aspect, yes.
Hi, Julian Goldman from Mass General Hospital. A few things. Number one, we have a breakout group on medical device interoperability, and so I welcome anyone who wants to continue this conversation to please join us. Number 2, a standard will be published in a few weeks from ASTM, and the standard is F2761 on the integrated clinical environment, which includes the kind of applications that you just presented. It doesn't tell how to connect, but it talks about risk management, the complexity, the need for decision support, localized operator control, safety implications, collection of all data with essentially a black box recorder and so forth in order to address problems when they will occur, because of course they will with any network system. And so we can discuss that during the breakout session. And then finally, I would mention that I think your presentation was excellent, and it demonstrates the importance of understanding the clinical requirements and the need in every given clinical environment for specific functionality. And when we look in the operating room, you presented, of course, a neurosurgeon's perspective. And when I analyze this, I look at it from an anesthesiologist's perspective. And then when we look in the neonatal ICU, we see a neonatologist. And I think that one of the challenges we have is indeed to look broadly across these high acuity needs in healthcare so that the technology solutions that emerge will be reasonably broadly applicable, maybe not universally applicable, but somewhat broadly applicable, and address, I think, those excellent comments that were just made about the siloing and proprietary solutions. So just some comments.
Yeah. No, I certainly agree, and that's why I think you have to have a standard that is an extraordinarily large tent. This is not a neurosurgical solution. It's not an anesthesia solution.
Right.
It is a generalized suggestion for really getting at the issues. And to me, to have a famous actress die of an epidural hematoma in the skiing accident in Quebec, when that is something that we routinely treat on the streets of St. Louis with great ease, really, I think, argues to the point that the distribution of expertise is so geographically non-continuous that we really need to be able to project this type of expertise throughout the network, and that should not allow that's not allowed to happen.
Yeah. And I would also make the invitation to you and to others here to participate in our program on medical device interoperability, which we have based at a consortium in Boston and at Mass General Hospital. Mm-hmm. URL is mdpnp.org for medicaldeviceplugandplay.org.
Hi, Paul Crawford from Intel. So I put on a couple of different hats. First an IT manufacturer and promoter of standards hat. But I think that's what you've painted as a realm of possibility. When I put on my medical device manufacturer hat, I see all the problems that the regulatory bodies put in place around general interoperability opportunities, particularly as it relates to as complex and sort of life critical situations as you're describing in some of that. And so I would suggest as we have our federal colleagues here and the different representatives, the one that's missing from this conversation, and not really looked at as a research body, but somebody that we probably have to have discussions with as far as how we move the ball forward on this vision is the FDA and other forms of bodies, that serve as the watchdog of all the aspirational type of designs that exist out there. So I would promote that there are dialogues that need to be promoted between the research community and the FDA as far as ways that we can build a framework that allows these broader visions of interoperability of medical devices to be realized and all the goodness that can be reaped from the vision that you've painted.
No question about it, the legal aspects of this are quite daunting. At the same time, I think the imperative of the need is such that the legal issues should be able to be addressed in some sort of reasonable fashion.
Hoping for the last one to actually be a question.
Yep.
Well, it's a comment, and I'll try to make it into a question.
Make it
I guess.
Don't you think?
I'm Kay Connolly from Indiana University, and I think that the vision is really important and persuasive. And the one thing that I think is absolutely critical to get right as soon as you start hooking up these devices to the internet is that every security vulnerability you have on the internet comes into the operating room. And this is particularly problematic because most of these devices, hundreds of manufacturers, they were developed under a different paradigm, a different architecture, and so they haven't even thought about what the possible vulnerabilities are as soon as you have access from the internet, and to expect all of those vendors to actually be able to think through those issues really deeply as they get their products under the standard is really challenging. And it's even more problematic than in the process space when you incorporate the FDA. You know, it might take months to get an FDA to approve a firmware update. And so you might have this virus out on the internet that there is a patch for, but you can't even patch these systems because you have to get this approval. And so I think you have to bring the security community into this day one if you're going to move in that direction. And I don't know if you have any suggestions or thoughts on that. So sorry, it's not a question exactly.
Yep. Well, I'll address the question. The security issue is fascinating because having lived many years in a hospital, a local area network situation, I can assure you that security is not what it probably ought to be within a hospital room, within a hospital or local area network. The interesting thing is that by implementing specific firewalls, you could actually overall enhance that security as opposed to necessarily degrade it. Because right now, such firewalls are not commonly in place in many hospital settings. And so, to my feeling, in a way, you could make an argument that overall security could be enhanced through judicious application of firewall technology.
I'm confused by the fact that the next speaker just left. Okay, so aside from them both being health professionals by training, they're also distinctly identifiable in any room. Craig Fied by his bow tie, if not by the packets of technology sitting around him. And so we're going to hear now, glad to see you back. We're going to hear now about moving, in fact, outside of the of a particular focus on the surgery room and intensive instrumentation to an even broader access to the range of information available in the hospital, and somebody who has been an innovator in that space from hospital to academe to startup and now at Microsoft.
Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be here this morning. And may I just ask, to start, how many people in the audience have some sort of clinical background or clinical experience and exposure? Great. How many have an exposure to a deep understanding of statistics, biostatistics, or other statistical methods? Great. And how many are doing active research in the area of genomics, proteomics, metabolomics? Good. I always like to start by knowing who I'm about to offend. Let me share with you a few observations about where we are today and some of the things that I think are coming to us in the future. This slide is a graph of the time between a new breakthrough being discovered and the time when it is put into widespread practice in the medical profession. And if you extrapolate this line, something very interesting happens, that somewhere around the year 2030, there appears to be no further gap. That is, we expect that new developments will arise and be put immediately into widespread use. And the problem is we're in this weird situation where we sort of know when it's going to happen, but we have no clue what it will be. We're going over a blind edge. Now, there are people who know something about what will be there, and there are others who theorize a lot. One of the things that's quite interesting, published in Lancet just a couple of weeks ago, is the notion that of all the children being born today, about 60% in the developed world and about half worldwide will be hale and hearty at age 100, and about 20% will be hale and hearty at age 115. Now, this extrapolation is based on linear life expectancy growth that seems to be completely unabated and does not depend on any kinds of breakthroughs, just depends on sort of the normal pace of progress that we've seen. However, if you really look at the data going back into the 1600s, the best curve fit is really a logarithmic curve. And there are actually quite a few reasons to believe that what we've been plotting as a linear curve is just a somewhat fairly linear part of a logarithmic curve. And if that star up at the top is the most recent data point that says people will live to be 100. In fact, about half of baby boomers on this curve will be hale and hearty at age 100. So that really raises a lot of social questions about what would the world be like, and it's not that far away. So here are some tips: how to remain alive and healthy and make it to 100. The first one is don't die from old age. The second one, don't die from things other than old age. You know, don't get H1N1 flu and be at the high-risk category. Don't get malaria. Don't be hit by a car. Don't need the services of our neurosurgeon network or not. And then you'd like to be feeling well and active, so you'd like to keep your body in good repair as well. And this can be particularly important because there are those who would make a convincing argument today that if you can survive the next 35 years, you may have no normal end to your lifespan. That is, you may die only through misadventure, because we learn how to fix stuff faster than it breaks. Now, I'm not saying that's true. I am saying that there are some who make a very convincing argument, but it sort of starts with things like surgical repair and mechanical prostheses to keep yourself going, you know, discs and artificial hips. And as this sort of thing goes on, you start to get this plug and play, you know. Here we have standards, you know, for bioprostheses. Of course, if you move to stem cells, we have in vivo stem cell therapy now that involves treatments to the retina, the spinal column, bone marrow, liver, brain, peripheral nerves. It really gets to be quite impressive. And even more impressive is what people are doing by creating scaffoldings, ex vivo scaffoldings, and then putting the stem cells in them, and then growing artificial organs, livers, kidneys, bladders, heart valves. All of these have actually been implanted in human bodies and have continued to function. Of course, one of the other things that we think about is nanorobotics, which seems very sci-fi, you know, these little nanites that will crawl around our bodies and fix things, maybe specially engineered viruses. I didn't realize how far this had come until I saw this is actually a snapshot from a video of a small nanite bead that is artificially powered, that actually moves on its own through human blood and performs some function. And it was done by a graduate student in their lab. It's not Nobel Prize work or anything. So we are probably very close to having nanorobotics doing actually useful work for us somewhere in the body. Of course, the holy grail is to go in and fix our genes so that we just don't get old, so that our bodies know how to repair themselves, perhaps some sort of retrovirus that we would infect ourselves with that would modify the gene. And I'll just comment that all of these things probably will bring side effects. And so should we be worried about the side effects of them? Well, I'll just point out that people tolerate a surprising number of side effects in order to gain performance enhancement. Severe acne, bad breath, yellowing of eyes and skin, brain cancer, depression, violent behavior. Men get testicular shrinkage and impotence. Women get deep voices. Men get high voices. I don't know why that works that way, but just somehow seems to. And we tolerate this. Our highest performing athletes routinely inject themselves with drugs that cause these things to get that performance boost. So we probably would tolerate something that allowed us to, you know, live forever, or some facsimile of forever, that gave us bad side effects like allergy to sunlight and needing to, you know, drink a lot of blood or something like that. So this concept that we might be transformed is a very old one and a very honored one, but for the first time it's becoming something very close to reality. But while we're waiting for that, we have some real problems that we've got to deal with. You know, 100,000 deaths due to respiratory infection annually, 100,000 due to medical error, and that's not counting errors of diagnosis, which arguably dwarf the errors of medications or errors done with wrong side surgery and that sort of thing. And we've got this big problem of cost of care that everybody's worried about today. And the first question to ask about cost of care is, what are you getting for it? Because I think if we all lived to be 1,000 and we were really healthy that whole time, we would probably not think we were spending too much today for the care we were getting. But what we're getting just doesn't seem to be working. And I would submit to you that this guy is a doctor. So this shaman actually is licensed to practice the kind of medicine he practices. And he has a lot of things that he knows how to do. But the question is, do you think that by manipulating his reimbursement incentives that we're going to somehow get better outcomes out of the medical care that he delivers? And I would submit that the answer is probably not. And that's not a far-fetched illustration, because when I was in medical school, I was taught to deal, if you're dealing with a kind of a rash and you're not sure what it is, if it's wet, dry it. If it's dry, wet it. And if neither of those work, then try putting steroids on it. See if that'll help. And lo and behold, that same advice is being given to medical students today in our medical schools. And I submit to you that that's really a form of shamanism. The reality is that autopsy-proven diagnosis shows a discordance, a diagnostic discordance in the range of 40%. 80% of blood clots that are fatal are completely unsuspected until we do the autopsy. Half of fungal infections are not diagnosed at all unless there's an autopsy, not suspected. Many cancer patients who are being treated at Man's Best Medical Center are found to have died from a cancer other than the one we were trying to treat them for. So this is a real problem. And of course, declining autopsy rates are a huge problem, with fewer than 3% of deaths going to autopsy today, and most US hospitals performing no autopsies in the past couple of years. So the issue is one of clinical judgment and other types of guesswork, because across the board, clinical judgment is only about 50% correct when you test it and hold it up against a gold standard test. Often, there is no definitive test, and clinical judgment is all we have. And when a clinical definitive test does exist, very often it's either too expensive or too invasive or too inconvenient for us to really deploy it. So we're stuck with tests. Most tests today are what I would describe as inferential tests. They're based on detecting the gross signs of organ dysfunction. Your liver is swollen, there is a funny spot on your lung, or there's some altered biochemistry in a very gross way. The chemical that your liver is supposed to process is not being processed, so it builds up in your body and you turn yellow. With diseases of this sort and inferential tests of this sort, a very good test might detect 99% of the positive ones and reject 99% of the negatives. We would call that a good test. And if the disease prevalent is about 50% in the population, then that positive test means 99% likely you do have the disease. So that's good. I'm satisfied with that. The problem is, sometimes called the Bayesian paradox, is that the result doesn't depend so much on you and what's going on in your body. It mostly depends on what's going on in the population. That if the disease prevalence is only 1 in 100, then that same positive test only gives you a 50-50 chance of actually having the disease. So this is a real problem, because when we look at the power zone for inferential tests, it's that red zone, 40 to 60%, is where these are very good discriminators. But where are all the big problems in health? They're all down here. Lung cancer, breast cancer, prostate cancer, all below 7% incidence and prevalence. So these are not good tests, and they don't lead us to good outcomes. And of course, there's another problem. This Bayesian confusion thing, it's very hard to think about that. Physicians have a tendency to regard the test as truly positive, even when it's only 50% likely to be predicting something. And that seems to be hardwired into the brain. And the Bayesian confusion lobe is, just above the BattleBot addiction area and fairly near the fear of elevators and romantic notions sections of the brain. The other things that seem to be hardwired into the brain are the risk aversion lobe, the not my fault area, the availability heuristic, and a favorite one, the Monty Hall paradox. Monty Hall's paradox is an interesting probabilistic paradox. Most of you are probably familiar with it. It's primarily interesting not because it is unique. It's a simple exemplar of a huge class of problems. It's primarily interesting because it's so easy to prove, so easy to demonstrate, and yet so hard to think about clearly. Other kinds of problems that come up in medicine all the time, there are about 150 of these well-known cognitive biases. The availability heuristic says we think things will be more likely if they're more readily available to us to think about. So if we saw a case that was very, very disturbing, it will seem much more likely to us in the future. Confirmation bias says once I decide that you have a particular disease, all the evidence in support of that seems very convincing, and the evidence against it seems very easy to neglect. The self-serving bias allows me to take responsibility for your positive outcome, but your negative outcome, well, that really couldn't have been avoided. That was sort of not my fault. And then wishful thinking, I think we all understand, probably responsible for more deaths than anything else in medicine. Here's a good example of Monty Hall in medicine. If a patient's likely to have any of 3 combinations of health markers, so they could have AA, BB, or AB, and each combination is equally likely, and we do a test and it shows that the patient has 1 A marker, what's the probability that the other marker is also A? So if you're like most people, and most doctors, virtually 100% of doctors will say, well, it can't be BB because I already got an A, so that takes 1 out. That leaves 2, so it's 50-50. But the reality is, the real way you should think about this is there are 3 A's in that equation, and only one of them is opposite of B, and therefore There's a 2-to-1 likelihood that the other marker is an A. So this is a problem. If your clinician is going to be off, between 50-50 and 2-to-1 is a big difference when we're trying to make inferences. Another problem is timing. These are airplanes, snapshot of all air traffic over the United States. And the air traffic controller can detect what's going on early, and if a plane is headed down a little bit towards a mountain, can give them a 1 or 2 degree course correction up or left or right, and they will miss the crash. But if you don't detect that until they're 300 feet from the ground and the klaxons are going off, then only heroic efforts will pull the plane out of a crash landing. And if you miss it, you either overshoot your airport by 150 miles and lose your license, or you may have to land somewhere different. The problem, of course, is that we don't tolerate this in air traffic, but we tolerate it in medicine. Here's a cancer cell, a breast cancer cell. It's detectable on a mammogram at 30 doublings. 30 doublings means 1 billion cells. It's about 1 centimeter across. It takes 8 years to get there, 8 years of doublings. You can see it in the very lower right-hand corner of the screen. It's a little mass. The radiologist said this was obvious cancer. But a mammogram taken 6 months earlier showed no sign of abnormalities. And so the question is, how is it that this can be going for 8 years and then we miss it? The problem gets worse because at 40 doublings, cancer is widely metastatic. It's almost invariably lethal. That's a kilogram of tumor mass. It's 1 trillion cells. And what that means is our window for detection by modern methods is only the last quarter, the last 25% of the entire growth curve of that tumor before it's absolutely fatalistically lethal. So we got to do something about that. I would submit to you that that's a good model for all disease. For every disease, by the time a patient has symptoms, or you can detect it with our crude tests, it's already in an advanced state. 99% of medical care is trying to pull out of that crash, and the other 1% is usually trying to put people back together after they've had that crash, where we're trying to fix them. So there's just something slightly wrong with this. What we need is these tricorder level breakthroughs, where we can just really see what's going on. And they exist today. They are here. They're on the horizon. Access to massive amounts of data is one of them. Systems biology approaches, imaging modalities, and definitive tests. So I'll speak about each of those. The first, and I think most important at this moment, is the promise of genomics, proteomics, and metabolomics, because they can definitively resolve false disease cognates. False cognates in linguistics are words that are alike, very similar, and they seem to come from the same root or same cause, but they actually came from very different sources. And in medicine, false disease cognates are diseases that look the same, but they're actually probably completely different in terms of their causes. So in the 19th century, we thought consumption was a disease. Now it's TB and cancer and degenerative diseases and neurasthenia and all kinds of other stuff. Today, we have all kinds of diseases that are probably garbage can diagnoses. And everything from dementia to arthritis to obesity. Anything with the word idiopathic or syndrome in its name is probably one of these. And the question is, can we tease them apart? That's the first promise. The second promise is that we will do real subgroup analysis on things that really are diseases, so that where we're told that a drug or treatment is effective in 15% of people with the disease, how crazy is that? Why would we expect that to happen? What is this? It's like the magic lottery in your body that the drug works or it doesn't work. The reality is, of course, that the drug works on everybody who really has that disease, and we just got 100 people together, only 20 of them had the disease. Penicillin works in 5% of people with pneumonia, about 100% of people who have bacterial pneumonia, pneumococcal pneumonia of a serotype that's sensitive. And even for something like, say, breast cancer, it's not one disease. Now with MammaPrint, we can track the DNA of the tumor. We're using 70 genes that we can tell which ones are turned on and turned off, and that tells us how to treat you, and we get 10x or 50x improvement in the survival curves just by doing this. The second promise here is that we will understand true causation in a way we never did before. So for example, pediatric febrile seizures, kid gets a high fever and has a seizure, and I was taught in medical school that there was no evidence of infection in the central nervous system, that this was purely a matter of how the temperature went up and how fast it went up. And in fact, also that there would be no sequelae. Mom, don't worry, your kid will be fine. I can't tell you how many times I've said that. And the question is it true? Well, it turns out that, yeah, if you do a spinal tap and you culture this fluid, nothing grows. But if you do genomic testing of the spinal fluid, you get a different story. Human herpes virus 6 and 7, influenza A, influenza B, non-polio enterovirus, mostly group A Coxsackie, strep pneumonia. So pathogens growing in the CNS that are causing this that really do have some prognostic value for how the patient's going to do and really may have interventions that we can and should be doing. And when you look really closely at the literature, it's very clear that the sequelae of these kinds of diseases have never been studied. We say, oh, the kid is at an appropriate grade level in school 3 years later, but you really have no idea how much cognitive function was lost. There's never been any neuropsychometric testing. So I would argue that one of the things we need is to really get more rigorous about what we mean when we say we've got a diagnosis and when we say we've got an outcome. Here are some of the breakthroughs that have been coming. Oh, been about a dozen, maybe more than that this year. A couple weeks ago, they suddenly found a virus that was the cause of chronic fatigue syndrome, and it's a retrovirus. They say you can think of it as something like a non-fatal form of AIDS because it incorporates itself into your own genome the same way HIV virus does. So the question is, how many years can we walk around and tell everybody that they have a psychiatric illness when they feel terrible before we find out that they really have a disease? And the answer is, well, we're at the point probably where 5 years from now, we will not be doing that anymore, not for anything. Going beyond just the genomics of identifying your genome and the pathogen's genome, we can now take the gene, which is in the upper left, and see that the gene is really just an encoding mechanism for all the proteins that get made in your body. And the proteins are with a form of electrophoresis over on the right and down below. And in the far left lower corner is the interactions of all of these genes, of all of these proteins as they degrade themselves and break down and signal, and that's a metabolomic pathway. And that process takes us beyond what is it and helps us to get to what is it doing at this moment. And systems biology is the branch that starts to tackle this question of how do I take all this diverse data from hundreds of sources and actually start to figure out what's going on using some intensive computational methods. So I could measure all this stuff and get a pattern of gene activation and identify disease processes before there's any gross anatomic or biochemical disruption. So I can detect your liver disease before you turn yellow, or your breast cancer before there's a lump or a shadow on the mammogram. Distinguish Alzheimer's from mad cow disease and other forms of encephalopathy just on the basis of a single drop of blood. These are laboratory realities today. In the past 2 years, we have developed serum protein tests for Down syndrome, appendicitis. The appendicitis one is actually done as a urine dipstick test today. Alzheimer's disease, skin cancer, all things we could not diagnose in this way before. And when it comes to computational intensive sort of work, new imaging technologies are coming out fast and furiously. Here's one called diffusion tensor MRI. It tracks the rate of diffusion of water along a particular axis compared to other axes. So it's very intensive computation, and it gives you these beautiful images of things you could never before tease out that make a big difference. The challenge, of course, is, as the previous speaker pointed out, there is a lot of data being generated. And as we get these things networked together, it all becomes accessible, and what do we do with it? When I was in medical school, the senior hematologist told me that when he took his board exams in hematology, one of the questions was, discuss the blood proteins. And the correct answer at that time was, well, there are two, albumin and globulin. And of course, the challenge is that today there are about 100,000 known or inferred blood proteins over 10 orders of magnitude in quantity and in circulating kinds of things. And this proteomic milieu changes over time, and it's different in every person. The number of kinds of things where we generate data is huge. And the question is, what am I going to do with all that data? So the first thing people want to do is to say, well, I'll pick and choose. I'll decide some of this data I can keep and some I'll throw away. But the answer really is, don't do that. Put all the data in there because we can do some very cool things with it. Chris Anderson has described this as the petabyte age, the end of scientific theory as we know it. The idea being there's so much data that we can't wrap our human minds around it. We have to use inferential algorithmic approaches, and they will tell us when there's an association, and then we get to go and explore the meaning of that association. And an example of this is naive proteomics, where they take mice, and some of them are given skin cancer by being treated with a carcinogen, And then they feed all the digested serum proteins into a big analyzer, and there's no model. And the analyzer just magically can distinguish the cancer mice from the non-cancer mice just by looking at clustering of peptide patterns. You don't have to understand any theory behind it or know why it works. All you need is data. And you need lots of data. You need so much of it streaming through that you can't put your human mind around it at all. One of the things that I've spent about 20 years doing is building data management engines. One of them is called Amalga, and it's now being sold by Microsoft, and I am a Microsoft employee at this time. It takes data from hundreds or thousands of different systems, breaks it down into tiny little data atoms, puts it in a data core, and allows it to be reassembled on the fly by end users for any purpose. So for example, and actually the data comes not only from these large enterprise data clouds down at the bottom, which we sell, but also from a free consumer-based cloud at the top called Health Vault, where we get data from home devices and from individual patients putting their data in and from small practices. So you can really get your arms around the end-to-end ecosystem of data for patients. The goal then is perfect care every time, and what that means to us is personalized medicine and acute care when somebody's sick, but it also means research and public policy, the same data across that entire continuum. So here's a screen that shows 50,000 data elements, and you can pick any of them that you want and throw them up as a named view. Name and age and sex and complaint and admitting date and time and most recent labs and x-rays and that sort of thing. And with one click, you can bring up any filtering clause, and you can filter on any Boolean combination of 50,000 data elements. So instantly, 1 second, I can find all the cardiovascular cases that were seen in this room or in this unit or by this doctor or at this hospital for this month or this year. In 1 second, I can see all the patients who were supposed to get aspirin but didn't get it, or were supposed to get a beta blocker for their heart attack and didn't get it. I can look at any kinds of rows of interest, not just 1 row per patient or 1 row per visit, but I can look at 1 row per charge item, or 1 row per test result, or 1 row per incidence of blue eyes, or anything at all that you might choose. And these are end user functions. Users can create these dashboards and graphs that can sort of look at anything over time. So here's one somebody made that looked at the flu season year by year. And you see the flu season in the lower graph, you see it every year from 1998 up. And you see an extra spike in October of 2001. Can anybody tell me what that extra spike probably represented? Wasn't SARS, but that's a very good guess. This was in Washington, D.C., and it was the anthrax letter, this letter that contained anthrax that went through the postal system. And those people came to the hospital, they were sick, and they got admitted, and many of them, they got treated. More of them died than you would expect, and we don't actually to this day know why. But I'm going to contrast that with this photograph. This is Tokyo, 1993. That building is the headquarters of the Aum Shinrikyo cult. Those are the guys who did the sarin gas in the subway stuff. You folks remember that. This white box on the roof is something they came up and built on their roof, and in that cloud is anthrax that they were spraying from the roof for 6 weeks. Thousands of people became ill and went to area hospitals. Nobody detected any spike or anything at all of that kind. In fact, it was 8 years before we understood that this had been anthrax, before the samples were brought to Fort Detrick and the final work was done. And of course, in Washington, D.C., when we had the anthrax exposure, here with one click are all the anthrax cases that were in the hospital. And here you can, just with one click, map them and see where they all come from. These are not specialist functions. These are end user functions. And then you can drill down and see absolutely all data. So if there's an X-ray, if there's a lab, if there was an EKG, any drugs that were given, the clinical notes, anything. It's all in there. It's all one click away. So you can go both wide and deep in your efforts to understand, get a deeper understanding of what's happening. So when we give this to people, usually they have this attitude, like, where did all this data come from? And they're shocked when we say, well, you always had that data. You've had that data for 30 years. You just weren't using it in the right way. And so that's probably the most important thing that I would say we can do, is to start using it. Here's one last example. This is a 30-second graph made by a clinician, and it looks at, in case anybody thought H1N1 was being overhyped, that graph that's sort of off this chart, that's H1N1 in Washington, D.C. right now, and you can see it's an unprecedented level of flu activity. These people are really sick, and they're overwhelming our hospitals today. And you could see that that little anthrax spike is way buried down in there now. It no longer looks like a spike at all, given the last 2 years of activity. So this tells us what's happening, but it doesn't tell us why. Yet by mapping all the semantic relations between all the different facts that we know around that disease, we get these bubbles that get larger that represent areas of extreme interest, where lots of connections occur and where there's a high degree of causality implied. And we can start to zoom in on those kinds of things and ask questions like why. This is really the future of that sort of thing. So I think there are 5 forces that I would love to see shaping advances in health. One is truly definitive tests for a large percentage of known ailments. One is the application of systems biology approaches to unravel the complexity of all of this stuff. One is improved imaging techniques that are truly diagnostic. Evidence-based medicine, where we stop kidding ourselves about how good we are and start admitting that diagnosis A, I only have a 50% confidence in, and diagnosis B, I have an 80% confidence in, but it's not 100%. And finally, true data liquidity, in which all the data that's being generated truly can be made to move and go where it needs to go. And if we look at the curve of gold standard test discovery, we see that around 2020, we expect to have a gold standard test for every known human disease. Maybe there could be breakthroughs that would make it be faster than that, but this is the projected curve based on everything we know about how this stuff works. By that time, I would say that probably medical care will be pretty different, even though it's only 10 years away. When we know the exact pathogen and how the host's biochemistry works, why will I need to make any judgment calls? Maybe I don't need to go to a doctor at all. Maybe I just do that at home for myself. And the earlier we engage, the more we'll get this spectrum of wellness, where if you're on the left of this, you look very well and you're at home, you don't feel sick, and yet that breast cancer cell is in there growing. It's year 1, and we're picking it up because its gene expression is there in your body. And we don't have to intervene only when you get far over on the right-hand side where you're very sick and in the hospital. So we have a long ways to go to get there. I'm very optimistic about it, but no matter how hard it's going to be, sometimes the first thing you got to do is just get started. So thank you very much for your kind attention.
Questions for?
Hi, Chuck. Keith Stryer. That was great presentation. Right there at the end, you made a point, though, that I wanted to kind of push back on and get you to elaborate a little bit further. I think everyone's a fan of diagnostic innovation, including myself. But when you think about the prospect of finding a breast cancer cell 8 years before it's detectable under current technologies, I'm sure you'll acknowledge, and I'm sorry Zach is not still here, because he wrote a very powerful article on this a few years ago that got published in the New England Journal of Medicine. A high proportion of those early cancer cells may not turn into cancer, right? There's recently an article, I think it was in the New York Times perhaps, on the conversation about the realization, and I'm just picking cancer because it's an easy one. Obviously, there's a lot of other conditions and diseases, but the realization that cancer cells can potentially turn themselves off or go from being cancerous to non-cancerous. Many people are uncomfortable with that notion, but the medical community is becoming more sort of comfortable with the fact that not all cancer cells turn into metastasized cancer that needs to be treated, right? The possible overtreatment of the early detection of conditions is a huge financial burden potentially on the health system, and we talk about so many of these innovations in sort of this utopian context of 100% diagnosis, 100% prevention. It's wonderful, but we all know that we can barely afford the health care we have. So considering everything that's going on in healthcare reform, I wouldn't mind you opining for a moment on the reality of a world in which we can possibly diagnose everything, but should we treat everything, and how could we even afford to do that?
Thank you for that question. That's a very good and important area for us to be thinking about. And I, of course, am a little bit constrained for time, but tried to say at the beginning that there will be a lot of social issues that have to be surmounted in order for us to have any of this work. Every one of the things that we're proposing and everything that is happening, whether we propose it or not, is disruptive to our current way of life. The issue specifically that was raised here is one of whether earlier diagnosis will lead to unnecessary treatment and then to potentially bad outcomes of unnecessary treatment. One is that it will be very expensive and we cannot afford it, and the other is that it may lead to side effects and morbidity and problems that we would have preferred to avoid. And I would say, first of all, that we already today accept that burden 1,000 or 10,000 times bigger than it will be if we have truly definitive tests. That is, if I do total body scan on 100 people, I will find significant appearing abnormalities on 7 of those 100 people, and if I pursue those, I will cause more harm than good, because the false negative rate is fairly high. So if I make all of those kinds of problems go away, and I'm only left with the case where I might cause harm by treating something people really do have, I at least believe that we will have made the problem not worse, but better. Secondly, I would say that there is no requirement that we immediately intervene just because we have detected something. For example, with prostate cancer, we routinely today find classes of patients where we do some kind of surveillance in order to avoid the high morbidity invasive procedures that we would otherwise leap to. And so all I'm arguing is that when we understand diseases better and when we're no longer confused about who really does have what disease, we will be able to truly understand the natural history of these diseases, and the therapy that's needed may in fact be a completely benign therapy that induces or encourages the cancer cell to redifferentiate itself into a benign form. So I think this is way outside of my field, and it's hard for me to speculate on what future therapies might be. At the moment, I'm excited enough about the notion that I might get better than 50-50 when I'm trying to diagnose a patient.
Thanks. I just want to start out by saying, as a physician and scientist myself, I don't share your optimism that by 2020 we will have these panacea of diagnoses and so forth. I think that is what I view is what I would like to see is us expand our view of systems biology. And these disorders involve the interactions of many different genes and proteins in very complex ways, and to incorporate data from some of the things that we've actually talked about earlier in this conference, data that are easily obtainable, electrocardiographic data, to get a holistic data from pulse oximetry, data from ambulatory, how active a patient is. And I think a holistic assessment of the patient, which includes a lot of the things that you've sort of mentioned with these other sort of low-lying fruit, we can increase the positive predictive value of these tests. I think that's really an objective goal. That's my only comment.
I'm very glad you made that comment, because I went too quickly perhaps past the systems biology slide, and that was exactly the point I would have wished to make. So thank you very much. Dr. Hood and others at the Institute for Systems Biology have clearly demonstrated that adding bioelectrical signal detection, such as EKGs, but other bioelectrical forms as well, measures of physiology and physiognomy, can markedly improve the ability of systems biology to converge on a correct diagnosis or correctly differentiate two diseases that appear to be the same but are in fact different. And so I think that's a very, very key point. It is a holistic approach that we need. And that's, of course, what makes the data problem so much more difficult.
I enjoyed your talk, and I wish I could believe your optimistic projections. I found the talk a little bit frightening in that it reminded me of talks I heard in the field of artificial intelligence some years ago, where people were predicting that in 10 years, so many interesting problems would be solved. And that led eventually to what I would call the AI winter in funding and things when those projections were not met. And I'm just concerned that the more people that go around and give talks saying that in 10 years we'll have solved these amazingly hard problems completely, the harder it's going to be for people who have more modest but perhaps more attainable goals to actually get people excited about what they're trying to do. So I'm just nervous about what strikes me as over-promising.
I think you're really right about that danger and that risk. And I would only have to make a guess as to which of the 3 classes of people you fell into that I would have offended today. But The reality is I don't think of myself as a force for evil, normally when I get up in the morning. And yet it is as scary to me as it is to you that some of this stuff, it's scary whether it's true or whether it's not true. And I will be honest with you, I don't know how much of what I presented to you I can wholly believe in. I definitely believe that these are possible views of the future. I believe that there's real hard evidence underlying each of these things. The graphs that I showed you represent curve fitting to processes that are a sort of aggregative processes where one builds upon the next and builds upon the next. And those kinds of processes look linear for a long time, but they do hockey stick. They are, in fact, logarithmic processes when they really get going. If you look back 10 years and ask the question, what it looked, or 20 years, and ask the question, what could you imagine about today, about cell phones and Blackberries and internet and Wikipedia and stuff like that that just came out of nowhere, you realize that the projections that informed people are making about the growth curve here, they're not as outlandish as they may at first appear. Of course, the key to this is for everybody to keep working. And I would say actually the thing that's most scary to me is not the things that you suggested, that we may fail and therefore end up in a funding winter. My fear would be that some high school student in the garage succeeds before we do and unleashes a new organism on the world. Because there are high school science projects today that are building new organisms, and they think that's fine. And I don't personally think that's such a great idea. Or that we may be right about parts of this, but not right about other parts. So we don't solve the social problems, and everybody lives a long time, and then we really do start to destroy the world. Or apocalyptic things. SARS really does come around like the H1N1 did, and we're knocked back to the Stone Age. So there are, I think, a lot of things to be afraid of. I'm not afraid that I personally am going to stop us from getting funding. Thank you, though.
So what I'd like us to do now is to broaden this conversation. We've just heard two visions of the future. One, let me just characterize a part of what Craig said, comes from the diagnosis side, and one comes from the treatment side, if you regard that as the role of an operating room. And we've seen examples in the past of the influence of technology on parts of our world. One of my favorite examples is actually the telephone. If you think about what happened, what telephones were like when they were first introduced, there were human operators, and it was the role of the operator to connect the telephone of the caller with the telephone of the recipient of the call. And it was a labor-intensive activity. And there was a projection at one time that said, this can never scale. If we look at the increase in the number of telephones and the connectivity that people are going to want as the prices drop, everybody's going to have to be a telephone operator in order to have enough people to make these connections. So what happened? If you go back and you look at it now, everybody's a telephone operator. Right? We all place our own telephone calls. We got a certain degree of automation. It totally changed the vision of an activity that we thought we understood. Simple idea: take the caller, connect the caller with the recipient. So my question in this context is, we're in some sense doing the same thing again. We're starting out with our use of technology and automation by automating the ways that we have historically done things. Okay, and that's not going to scale, and it's not going to continue. So suppose we, in our research endeavor, try to look ahead and say, suppose we really don't depend on humans doing what they've always done and enhancing their ability to do what they always do, but instead take into account that we have the capabilities of all of this technology. How would we do healthcare, and what would be the way that we could move ahead most quickly, and what's the research we need to do? Are we going to have hospitals, or are we just going to have activities centered around operating rooms? There's lots of other stuff that goes on in hospitals now. Are we all going to do our own diagnosis, or what's going to be the role of the professional health? So, and I'm asking this question from the point of view of a technologist, of a computer scientist, as someone whose experience with medicine is primarily my own healthcare experiences. There are a number of you in the room who are healthcare professionals. What would most enhance your ability to do your own job so that you focused on your skills and not all this other stuff? And where do you think we're going, and what's the research that would really make a difference in moving us ahead, even if it's a ways away, even if right now it's too expensive? What are the long-term research areas we should be pushing on?
I'd like to respond to that. One thing that's of interest is recently we went through an accreditation process for the American College of Surgeons in our trauma bays at the hospital. And I can tell you, as long as we have motorcyclists, we're going to have hospitals and trauma bays. They're very good at producing injuries, by the way. And the issue there was that they actually made the recommendation, you need to get rid of your electronic health record in the emergency room. And this kind of flabbergasted, because we're kind of proud of our electronic health record. And he said, well, the problem is that when you're resuscitating a motorcyclist, everybody's working on the motorcyclist, and no one's interacting with the computer that has his electronic health record. And so what happens is, after a while, after everything's done, the nurse comes back and creates a novel of what happened. You know, oh, we did this, I think, and we did that, and yeah, then we did that, I think. And the fact is that that does not reflect what actually happened in the trauma bay. And therefore, trying to do quality improvement is almost impossible. So unless you have someone who sits there, like a telephone operator, and takes all the data and puts it in real time as it's happening, you don't capture the event. And therefore, you can't do quality improvement. I would suggest that the automated process allowing us to interface and record the interventions as they occur within a time-dependent situation is the perfect way of capturing the entire event and then replaying the event and say, well, where did we go wrong? When should we have intervened? When should we have given this drug, et cetera? And it's that elimination of the human step that I think is really going to be key for quality improvement purposes.
Julian.
Yeah, Julian Goldman, Mass General Hospital. I would agree completely with what Dr. Buchholz just said. The ability to record and obtain rich contextual information is one of the key barriers today to real-time decision support, other safety systems, and so forth. What I would also say is, in speaking not really for myself, but from focus groups that we've held with other clinicians over the last several years, surgeons, anesthesiologists, clinical engineers, what we find is that there's no shortage of really good ideas. Now, if you talk to any experienced and interested clinician, they will tell you, this could be a physician, could be a nurse, could be other clinicians, they will tell you, they will provide scenarios in which they could have either prevented injury, improved the quality or efficiency of care, or they wish things could be different in some way to allow them to do things they can't do today, like remote viewing of data or remote control of instrumentation, as we heard in the presentation before. And so I think the issue is not really finding 1 or 2 or 10 or 20 of these applications. It's an understanding that we don't have an ecosystem today that facilitates innovation. So we don't have a means to acquire the information throughout the continuum of patient care. We can't do it at the resolution that's needed for all these innovative applications, and including many that we heard about this morning. And then we have no way to safely control actuators and things that deliver medication or fluid or energy and so forth. So what we lack is the ecosystem as a whole. And if you hold these kind of focus groups with clinicians, after about a half an hour, the first thing they complain about is the wires. Get rid of the wires. I don't want to see wires. In fact, someone came up with the term malignant spaghetti at one of our focus groups in '05. It's a great term, and then became the name of a conference held at NYU. That's the first thing they complain about, is the stuff in the environment. And then the richness of the ideas start to come out. And there are many, many examples of where have been demonstrated either in the literature or from first principles or root cause analysis, where we could improve patient safety, save lives, and so forth by improving the interaction of equipment. And so I think it's not, it's easy to propose a few specific applications, but I think it's more important and more challenging as a research objective to have the expertise of this community work on developing an ecosystem where devices can all interconnect, information can be acquired in real time, and then actuators can be controlled as needed, and decision support tools can be deployed in an open way. And one more thing I wanted to mention is there will be, since there was a question about FDA engagement in this work, there absolutely has been FDA engagement in this area for the last 5 years or so, and there will be a workshop sponsored by the FDA in January of this year, on January 25th, 6th, and 7th. The Federal Register notice isn't out yet. And I can provide more details, or again, they'll be posted to our website sometime in the next few weeks. Thank you.
I think one part of what was just said is particularly interesting, and that, of course, is how do you understand or use the information that comes out of focus groups? And focus groups are very interesting. You know, the CEO of Porsche was asked how he felt about focus groups, and he said, well, we run a lot of focus groups, but when we go in and ask people who are Porsche owners what do they want in their next model Porsche, we hear things like, well, I want side airbags and better fuel economy, and they go on more room, more trunk space, and when they're done, he says, I just look at them because every time they've just designed a Volvo. But they're not going to buy a Volvo, right? They're going to go back and buy another Porsche. So people's ability to understand their own needs and motivations, I think, is less acute than I would wish it would be. And of course, that's true for each one of us. The other focus group story is from Henry Ford, who, when asked how did he know what his customers wanted, he said, I didn't know what my customers wanted. If you asked my customers what they wanted, they would have said they wanted a faster horse. And so sometimes people have to take a leap to get to the future that we've been asked about. I will say that the trend I believe is going to be a controlling one, is the trend to have things appear at a very rarefied level where only a Nobel laureate can do it, and then it's only available in the most expensive labs, and then it makes it into a few hospitals, and ultimately it makes its way down to all the community hospitals, all the little outpatient centers, individual practices, and finally, like blood pressure cuffs and glucometers and things like that, makes its way into the home. And I see no reason why that trend shouldn't continue, and why the home of the future shouldn't handle most of your acute care needs through a combination of diagnosis and on-site synthesis of compounds that are needed. There's a big class of things that you can't do for yourself, but the class is not as big as you would think. Even you might think neurosurgery is something that has to be done in an OR. That's not true. You can go on the internet. And for those of you who have your browser up now, you can try it right now. On YouTube, you can find 50 videos of people doing trephination, self-trephination at home, because they have this peculiar delusion that there's not enough space in their skull for their brain, and that if they open a hole, they'll be, restored to the vigor that they had when they were a baby and their fontanelle hadn't closed. But it's a peculiar delusion, but they successfully trephinate themselves day in and day out. And so I would submit that it's at least theoretically possible that people could do an awful lot in the way of procedures for themselves as well.
I would wonder the definition of success in that situation. They may survive, but I'm not success, and I may not be part of it.
So, Craig, in light of that, what's the research that needs to be done to start the trickle-down?
In my mind, if I could fund one thing and change one thing about the way we work in this country, it would be around the area of autopsies. Because without autopsies, there are no real outcomes. It's hard to figure out what's going on when for half the people we don't actually know what they died from, and we've misdiagnosed them, basically. And there are a lot of reasons not to do autopsies. Mostly it's squeamishness, cost, religious convictions. Fortunately, recent breakthroughs in imaging have allowed us to do virtual autopsies. You can just crank up the radiation dose as much as you want because it doesn't hurt the cadaver. And you can take a vial of blood and you can do quite a bit of proteomic work to figure out which organs were failing in which ways. And it's possible to get perhaps as good and perhaps better than a typical autopsy. I think if we did autopsies, if the federal government funded autopsies on 100% of deaths, virtual autopsies on 100% of deaths, right, just pay for the scanner and you're sort of done. And if we also found a way to get medical data released into the research domain, so for example, maybe people are organ donors, maybe they could be donors of their data at death. All their data goes into this big research suite that's public domain, even though it's identified or only slightly de-identified. I think that if we were to do those kinds of things, we would see very rapid improvement in all the places where we need it.
Audience, are you all content with that? Are you, what I'm concerned about is that we're not being sufficiently bold.
I would like to take you up on that. I think we need it not so, maybe an autopsy, but it would be very preferable to actually run, let's say, an imaging study after each surgery, perhaps, maybe soon after, and then again a little bit later, to see if what the surgeon wanted to do actually happened. It's a small example of the various kinds of outcome studies we might do. But to me, that might be more valuable than 100% autopsies.
And that's already been implemented. I mean, a standard of neurosurgery now is after every cranial intervention, you get an image and say, did you do what you wanted to do? So that is already being implemented. Perhaps the granularity of that imaging is not what we would want it to be if you could do it in a perfect situation where you don't have to worry about the survival of the patient after the imaging. But that is already being implemented into current medical parlance.
Is it being used?
Every time. Yeah. So basically now, if our residents don't get an image post-op, there's hell to pay, because now we do not have evidence that you achieved the goals you wanted to with the intervention.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Someone's back there.
So the discussion about the communication of devices is good, but if you look at the events report and analysis of adverse outcomes, the one that top of the list is communication not among devices, but human beings. So one of the things, of course, is that how we can use computing to support the human-human communication. And that's probably not a substance replacing human-human, but amplifying or making more effective in a sense. So I wonder if the two panelists could, from their physician practice, could highlight their ideas.
You know, I get a lot of flack for wearing a Bluetooth thing in my head. And one of my responses to my children, who are perhaps the greatest flack providers of all, is that, you know, to me, a Bluetooth headpiece helps me hear. And it helps me hear just like eyeglasses. The difference is that I can hear my wife, who's currently in Salt Lake, trying to get my in-laws to Park City and find out whether or not they're snowed in or not. I can hear around the world with a Bluetooth headpiece. To me, the technology is the communicator. It is the infrastructure that allows us to communicate. And if you allow an expert, like a neurosurgeon, to call into a local community ER, see what is going on and say, time out, this person has an epidural, that person's head needs to be tree-fined. And if the tree-find's done in the community hospital, as opposed to waiting for the patient to get to a hospital that has a neurosurgeon, you've saved a life. So to me, the technology is the enabler of the communications between humans as it is between devices.
I agree very much with that statement, and I'd like to add that one of the problems we have is that the processes we use today are very complex in taking care of patients. In an emergency department or an ICU, the number of human-human interactions and human-machine interactions that has to occur in order to deliver care can be quite large. In a typical hospital, from the moment the decision is made to do a blood test till the moment that result comes back, 35 people are involved, and there are 17 handoffs that must occur. And so the problem becomes very much compounded. When we do cognitive research, what we find is that if you need something and you get it in less than a second, you can maintain focus. In fact, at an eighth of a second, it feels instantaneous, and at a second, it feels sluggish, but you maintain focus. Above a second, there's cognitive drift that occurs. You can see it in people's eyes. You can measure it in their electroencephalogram. And at 10 seconds, people get cognitive capture by some other task, and they start to try to multitask. They place another phone call. They start writing a note. They start doing email while they're engaged in this conversation. And so the challenge is, how do we reduce that chain of communications to the simplest possible set of communications? Technology can do a tremendous amount to simplify that process, and therefore to take a lot of the error, the communications error, out of it.
I was getting some cognitive drift, but no, that was interesting. Because I wanted to kind of comment. I was stimulated to speak by the previous questioner. That is the issue of communication versus device integration, and I think it's true that the evidence that's in the literature. Let's think about the studies that are in the literature. The evidence that's there is based upon today's available technology. It is with limited examples where things are developed solely for research and then scaled for research. And so we must be very careful about interpreting available data to determine what should be done for the future. And I'll provide an example of that. Researchers at the University of Florida in Gainesville 10 years ago hypothesized that they could improve the quality of chest x-rays in the intensive care unit if they could synchronize the exposure of the x-ray with movement of the chest with a ventilator. So the patients are on mechanical ventilators, chest is going up and down, and a radiology tech stands there with a trigger button in his hand, looks at the patient's chest normally, and tries to press the button at the exact right time to catch a phase of movement of the chest to have a standardized picture that can be compared with the previous day's exam, and also to have adequate lung inflation to have a good exam. So they hypothesized that if they synchronize those two and gate the image or do whatever can be done, it would be a better quality image. And they did. They shot 2 x-rays. They studied ICU patients. They had 5 radiologists review the image. Clearly, well, shouldn't use that word. Clearly, maybe I should, the images were better when one could gate the images. So, clear example of that. So what do we do about that today? In fact, nothing. Okay, you cannot do that in any hospital anywhere today because there is no integration platform and system to make that a reality. So there's only one study in the literature. People only find it if they search for it. And one would think that there wouldn't be value in doing that. But in fact, when we repeat chest x-rays in the intensive care unit unnecessarily, what's the cost of that? Well, there's the actual cost of the x-ray. There's the lifting of the patient every time to put the x-ray plate behind the back, which causes pain, can dislodge the breathing tube, and can dislodge lines, other intravenous and vascular lines, which it does all the time, and on and on and on. And yet, this is not something that we normally are aware of. And there are a fair number of examples like that. Others can be derived by looking at adverse incidents in the literature. But in general, we can't base our future decisions on the absence of these studies in the literature.
So I'd like to ask the technology people in the audience. You are hearing about needs. You're hearing about ways that the practice of medicine could be improved if certain capabilities were available. Which of those things do you think we as a information technology community already know how to do? And which ones do you think really are at the cutting edge of our research questions, speaking now as a computer scientist? Can I get anybody to stick his or her neck out?
So mine is partly a question about what would be needed in this situation. You talked about in the emergency room in a trauma case where you would want to record all information automatically so it could be reviewed later. And I'm wondering whether, so there's a difference between data that you can currently gather by devices that are on the patient, and what actually happens. So, you know, what people say to each other or what you see somebody does. And, you know, if the latter, if it's helpful to, I'm wondering whether it would be helpful to record the spoken interactions and the images of what happened along with the data, if you could later not have to view it all, but only see what you needed in order to understand what happened. I mean, that would be a very interesting research problem.
Absolutely. Again, we seem to be referencing this a lot, but one's mind wanders back to that Northwest plane wandering over Minneapolis. The issue is that if you had a data recorder, a black box, and for God's sakes, don't limit it to 30 minutes, because in this day and age, 30 minutes of data is just not reasonable. But if you could record a trauma event in a hospital bay, in a trauma bay in the ER, and find out the communications that were done, record the video, record the verbal communications between those individuals, you can then figure out what went wrong with that resuscitation. And I can promise you that in this day and age, lots of things go wrong in the resuscitation of a trauma patient. And it's just more acute in the trauma patient, but it's true of, you know, treating a diabetic and ketoacidogenic coma. It's true of all sorts of things. Recording those interactions between the human providers as well as the device would be key to replay and to improve your quality of care.
Well, let's take it further, and let's just say that documentation is a tremendous burden everywhere, and it's not accurate anywhere. Studies have shown that nurses' documented times at which things were done are a wild guess throughout the entire hospital, because they're busy actually doing things as opposed to recording them at that moment. And so the ability to have ambient detectors that could say the pill was given at this time, the drug was given at this time, this interaction occurred, would be incredible. And maybe, Eric, I see you sitting up there. This is a very interesting research question. How much data can you extract from a video, a video stream and that sort of thing? Maybe you could comment a little bit.
Well, I was lucky to have Richard in one of my breakout groups yesterday. We've cached and prefetched this question. We actually had a nice discussion about this yesterday, and in thinking about the future of potential documentation from the ongoing ambient recording of both the discourse, the language, and video feeds. I think there's definitely a very interesting. I'm not to the side of whether that's useful or not for enhancing the delivery of healthcare or quality of life of patients and so on. This is taking it as a challenge, it's definitely an interesting scholarly challenge. What excites me about this is that it's at the edge of doability. And when I think about pointing cameras, big Omnicam and 3 or 4 high-fidelity cameras at a trauma bay, and trying to sort of capture the structure and gestures to automatically document goings-on, I step back and I reflect about the interesting parts of that challenge. Do we have a grammar for trauma care? In other words, do we have and looking at Henry and Tanzim and others, what's the HMM, what are the transitions you would see for a particular setting, given the chief complaint, a complaint and a description from the paramedics? That would sort of set up the modeling and the extraction with multi-pass analyses to bring out landmarks, boundaries, segment phases of the analysis, understand the teamwork, the goings-on, who's talking to who in what way, and what are they trying to do together. I think it's a really interesting challenge, and it's related to the kind of challenges we face with, the automatic receptionist in multi-party setting, or several of the other applications working on that try to figure out what's going on in a multi-party, multi-actor setting. So it's just an interesting challenge problem. Can we do it? No, but this is the kind of thing that I see, agencies funding projects on, and the interesting part of it is that the applications, or the technologies would have many applications beyond healthcare, and it's some generic hard core computer science challenges embedded in them.
It's interesting. I just had a run-in with AT&T over a phone bill, and the first thing you do when you dial up AT&T, it says this conversation can be recorded for quality improvement purposes. Wouldn't it be nice if you came in with a knife sticking out of your chest to have the quality, your intervention will be recorded to figure out if the next guy who comes in with a knife in your chest might not be treated better.
In the back, person in the
Henry
back.
Fuchs, University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. I wanted to comment on this general area, and I think that it's not only at the edge of what we can do, but I think that the Trauma Bay example is first of expanding this into a lot more areas of healthcare. That is not just saying Trauma Bay, but in other serious surgeries, and other encounters within the healthcare profession. And in fact, I think the most exciting may well be in the home. That is, the question of, did somebody take a pill? But not only that, but, if they took the pill, is this Parkinson's patient, walking more steadily now than in the half hour before she took that pill? So I think this is a really great start for something that could expand to a very large area of healthcare monitoring and the conversation of what actually occurred as a consequence of some particular intervention. And I think it's just at the edge of what we can do.
That's a very interesting observation. It was about 3 weeks ago I saw demonstrated a pill that tells an outside detector that it was taken. It senses that it's entered your body, and it sends a little RF burst as it disintegrates. And at the same conference, I saw somebody demonstrating shoes that you put on that actually act as mobile gait sensors as you walk around, and they can in fact determine exactly that question, whether you're having a degradation or improvement in your gait.
So all of these, seems to me that it's a lovely problem for computer scientists, because it's not as if we're just looking at the video feed. It's that we have lots of different sensory inputs, and we do have some knowledge about, when this patient happened to come in. We do have a lot of history of what happened before, and we want to say, what happened? And so I think it fits in with a lot of what you had talked about of what is all the data that we have of, 50,000 encounters.
And the need is already present. Going back to the deep brain stimulation analogy, one of the endpoints is a person's ability to walk and manipulate their environment in a normal fashion. We program these generators to try to maximize their functionality. What better place to get that than to have video sensors in the patient's domicile and figure out how well they're doing and then relate that to the settings of the program.
Right, so that may be the proverbial canary. That is something which is a good test bed for testing the things that we work out. But if that proves to be successful, then we could expand it to lots of other kind of cases to see, did this particular therapy really benefit, this 91-year-old patient living alone?
Exactly.
Continuing on this thread, I negotiated with the other questioner that whether we'd be transitioning topics or not. We were going to transition, so just one comment on this. So there's quite a bit of work going on in the UBICOMP community and broader AI community on tracking and detecting activities of daily life, daily living. Tanzim, do you want to say a few words about that? Or Henry, do you have any comments you want to make about how you'd see, for example, taking some of the work the Intel folks did, or several different labs working on even medicine coming out of a medicine cabinet, tracking that, and so on? Tanzim might have a comment on that.
Yeah, sure. So one of the things that I think a lot of us in kind of UBICOM and kind of AI machine learning are working on is how we can build systems that are on individuals 24/7 and understand not only what they're doing in response to kind of changes in their life, but also how they're interacting with their environment and other individuals around them. So to get a better understanding of not just while they're in the hospital or receiving treatment, but just earlier on how behavior evolves over time and how And I think there are a lot of challenges there, both from kind of building systems that are unobtrusive, people will carry. Can we build mobile phones that are kind of our health therapists, to kind of algorithms and learning challenges that how can we deal with multiple individuals? How can we scale up at being able to monitor and find out relationships at a population scale? So I think that's a very interesting and challenging problem from the computer science perspective.
And here from Georgia Tech, jumping in on that conversation as well. I mean, one of the things that we've looked at, for example, with technologies in the home for medication adherence is the relationship between dictating and telling people exactly what to do when, as opposed to providing cognitive scaffolding to help them retain their independence and their capability of managing their own medical needs and medical routines. And it reminds me of the conversations that we had yesterday about the distinction between automation versus creating more and more capabilities to extend what physicians are able to do in the clinical environments. And the same is true for people as well. We could surround our bodies with machines to keep us optimally healthy and doing everything as prescribed, or we could surround ourselves with technology that increases our abilities to manage our own life, as well as to make the appropriate choices that we want to do as well. So this relationship of automation versus enhancing capabilities extends between patients as well as physicians.
So
please.
So this conversation just kind of went a little bit into what I was going to bring up, but we've been talking about patients and doctors. Oh, I'm Katie Seek from University of Colorado. And like you were talking about with the cancer patient, you don't know, you have cancer year 1, year 2, and such. So what I really like to kind of do is, instead of talking about patients, talk about people, and how do we help people kind of get information about their health and reflect on it. You're not going to be interested in it until you're sick. So how do we motivate people to continuously get this information and reflect on it when they're healthy and see these different changes? And this problem is not going to be just solved by IT people. We're going to bring in social scientists and different research groups. So I think that's going to be an issue. Important research problem is how do we all collaborate together and help motivate people to adopt and accept this kind of monitoring technology in their everyday life. We don't know how to do that.
I'd like to comment on that. I think that's a very important point, and it's an area where we've done a little bit of thinking and been a little bit surprised by where that thinking took us. I started by believing that people were only interested in their health data at the time of some sort of life change, when you become ill or a family member becomes ill. Sometimes when it's not necessarily being ill, but when you're going to have a baby, or when there's something that affects you that you can do something about. And I thought maybe we would have to do a lot of education to get people engaged in their health at earlier preventative times. But then I realized, actually, I was wrong. And I think you're wrong in the same way that I was wrong. And here's why. People really do a tremendous number of things that show that they are engaged with their health to the extent that they can be and that they think they can do something about it. So people take vitamins. In many cases, they take complex vitamin regimens that has very little data to support taking this vitamin versus that one, or more versus less. But it's a multi-billion-dollar industry, nutraceutical industries and supplement industries. People brush their teeth, and we brush our teeth with a fluoride-containing toothpaste based on research work that was done in Deaf Smith County, 70 years ago, where actually I imagine in the future, if we can do a little test on the probiotic and biotic nature of your mouth, the flora and fauna of your mouth, that we may be able to actually tailor your toothpaste to make your health of your mouth very much better. And I would imagine that people would be quite interested in that. I don't think it's going to take a big selling program to get people excited about those kinds of things. Home pregnancy tests and fertility kits. When we can get our hands on it and do something about it, we can do it.
I just wanted to interject. We're having a breakout session on that exact topic of motivation and for technology.
Another important issue is obviously the individual patient. My mind travels to a patient I just saw yesterday. We've operated on her 4 times, radiated her 3 times, instilled chemotherapy in her brain. She has a tumor in her motor cortex, and I've emphasized numerous times, if you develop weakness, then come and see me. And she came in paralyzed on one side of her body. And I talked to her mother, and it's clear she's had enough. Over 10 years, she's been intervened. It's time to say goodbye. And that's okay. I mean, that's her decision. But you have to take into accommodation the fact that all the education in the world is not necessarily going to change the topic if the patient has an altered motivation. And in this case, she had had enough medicine. And I abide by that decision. But education, but the patient's own motivation has to play a key import.
Maybe it's just from my own experiences. I work a lot with low socioeconomic populations who don't really have access to these kind of resources. They don't have computers. They only have cell phones and cable television and such. So yes, they do brush their teeth, but in my studies, I found that they're they're so busy that they just kind of address their family needs before they even look at their own needs. One of my mothers said, I only take care of myself when I put my makeup on for 5 minutes in the morning. And in that 5 minutes, she looks at herself, says, oh, I need more water, and then she tries to get it throughout the day. So that's like a main issue, is how can we help these people who don't have resources make more informed decisions and have something that's more culturally relevant to their current lifestyle. So I think those kind of monitoring and adoptions are important, fitting into your everyday life. You wear your iPod because you want to wear music. You don't wear your iPod because you want to know if I'm walking enough.
Okay, we're going to take 2 more comments, and then we're going to have a break.
I mean, this is just in addition to the notion that it's not just about motivating people to engage their data, but it's about increasing their literacy and their ability to do so. I mean, in the studies and the work that we're doing that has a great deal of everyday health data sampling, people may want to try to gather tons of data, but then they don't know what to do with it. They don't know how to set appropriate goals. They don't understand the relationship between sleep levels and stress levels and trips to Starbucks, and how to incorporate all that. So we're asking people appropriately, but we've got to provide the scaffolding for it to build up an entire set of literacy that they've never engaged with before. And we're worried about physicians not understanding statistical data, but now we're asking an entire population to be able to do so.
And just following up on some of these previous comments, in working in the area of elder care, I think it's often very important to look at the problem as not just communication and education of the patient, but it's really the interaction between the patient and the extended family. And that you have to keep that in mind, that I think technology can provide a lot in terms of tools for group decision making and group communication, and to make those kinds of hard calls, like, when has a person had enough? And so that sometimes people will even feel like pressured by family members to continue treatments when really they might not want it, but they're doing it for the sake of someone else.
Okay, thank you all. I think we've generated a lot of ideas that merit further discussion. I'd like to encourage us to pursue some of them during the breakouts. So let's work in the following way. Everybody should join a breakout group. You can join one with a hosted topic, or you can join a group that self-organizes after it's together, as we did yesterday. So if there are people who want to propose topics and host a discussion, let me ask that as soon as we break, before you get your coffee, you take a Post-it and a pen and put your topic up there. I have some sign-up sheets of paper. Then for those of you who don't want to lead but want to discuss, get your coffee first, and then come back and either sign up for a topic that's been listed or sign up to be in a group that will determine its own topic. I'm going to post the 10 locations where we'll have the breakouts, and let me just ask that we try to hold each breakout group to no more than 10 people so that it's possible to have a conversation. We're starting the break late, as you can see, and so we'll start the breakout groups. Let's see, it's now on my watch 25 of. So we'll start the breakout groups at 10 of 11, and we'll go until 12:15, which is when lunch was going to be available anyhow. So when you're done with your breakout group, grab your lunch in the foyer and come back in here at lunchtime. Let's thank our speakers. Thank you. That was really good. I will tell you that I was good.